While Churchill was still chafing in London about his general's delay in resuming the offensive in Egypt, Montgomery waited for 7 weeks after Alam al-Halfa in order to be sure of success. He finally chose to begin his attack in the night of October 23 to 24, 1942, when there would be moonlight for the clearing of gaps in the German minefields. By mid-October the British 8th Army had 230,000 men and 1,230 gun-armed tanks ready for action, while the German, Italian forces numbered only 80,000 men, with only 210 tanks of comparable quality ready, and in air support the British enjoyed a superiority of 1,500 to 350. Allied air and submarine attacks on the Axis supply lines across the Mediterranean, moreover, had prevented Rommel's army from receiving adequate replenishments of fuel, ammunition, and food, and Rommel himself, who had been ill before Alam al-Halfa, was convalescing in Austria. The British launched their infantry attack at el-Alamein at 10 p.m. on October 23, 1942, but found the German minefields harder to clear than they had foreseen. 2 days later, however, some of those tanks were deploying 6 miles beyond the original front. When Rommel, ordered back to Africa by Hitler, reached the front in the evening of October 25, half of the Germans' available armor was already destroyed. Nevertheless, the impetus of the British onslaught was stopped the next day, when German anti-tank guns took a heavy toll of armor trying to deepen the westward penetration. In the night of October 28, Montgomery turned the offensive northward from the Wedge, but this drive likewise miscarried. In the first week of their offensive the British lost 4 times as many tanks as the Germans but still had 800 available against the latter's remaining 90. When Montgomery switched the British line of attack back to its original direction, early on November 2, 1942, Rommel was no longer strong enough to withstand him. After expensive resistance throughout the daytime, he ordered a retreat to Fuka, but in the afternoon of November 3 the retreat was fatally countermanded by Hitler, who insisted that the Alamein position be held. The 36 hours wasted in obeying this long-distance instruction cost Rommel his chance of making a stand at Fuka. When he resumed his retreat, he had to race much farther back to escape successive British attempts to intercept him on the coast road by side-like sweeps from the south. A fortnight after resuming his withdrawal from el-Alamein, Rommel was 700 miles to the west, at the traditional backstop of Aguila. As the British took their time to mount their attacks, he fell back farther by stages. After 3 weeks, 200 miles to Beret, Albert. After 3 more weeks, in mid-January 1943, the whole distance of 350 miles past Tripoli to the Mareth line within the frontiers of Tunisia. By that time the Axis position in Tunisia was being battered from the west, through the execution of Torch. The German 4th Panzer Army, after being diverted to the south to help Kleist's attack on Rostov late in July 1942, see above the Germans' summer offensive in southern Russia, 1942, was redirected towards Stalingrad a fortnight later. Stalingrad was a large industrial city producing armaments and tractors. It stretched for 30 miles along the banks of the Volga River. By the end of August the 4th Army's northeastward advance against the city was converging with the eastward advance of the 6th Army, under General Friedrich Paulus, with 330,000 of the German army's finest troops. The Red Army, however, put up the most determined resistance, yielding ground only very slowly and at a high cost as the 6th Army approached Stalingrad. On August 23 a German spearhead penetrated the city's northern suburbs, and the Luftwaffe rained incendiary bombs that destroyed most of the city's wooden housing. The Soviet 62nd Army was pushed back into Stalingrad proper, where, under the command of General Vasily Chukov, it made a determined stand. Meanwhile, the Germans' concentration on Stalingrad was increasingly draining reserves from their flank cover, which was already strained by having to stretch so far, 400 miles on the left, north, as far as Voronezh, 400 again on the right, south, as far as the Terek River. By mid-September the Germans had pushed the Soviet forces in Stalingrad back until the latter occupied only a 9-mile-long strip of the city along the Volga, and this strip was only 2 or 3 miles wide. The Soviets had to supply their troops by barge and boat across the Volga from the other bank. At this point Stalingrad became the scene of some of the fiercest and most concentrated fighting of the war. Streets, blocks, and individual buildings were fought over by many small units of troops and often changed hands again and again. The city's remaining buildings were pounded into rubble by the unrelenting close combat. The most critical moment came on October 14th. When the Soviet defenders had their backs so close to the Volga that the few remaining supply crossings of the river came under German machine gun fire. The Germans, however, were growing dispirited by heavy losses, by fatigue, and by the approach of winter. A huge Soviet counteroffensive, planned by Generals G.K. Zhukov, A.M. Vasilevsky, and Nikolai Nikolaevich Voronov, was launched on November 19 to 20, 1942, in 2 spearheads, north and south of the German salient whose tip was at Stalingrad. The twin pincers of this counteroffensive struck the flanks of the German salient at points about 50 miles north and 50 miles south of Stalingrad and were designed to isolate the 250,000 remaining men of the German 6th and 4th Armies in the city. The attacks quickly penetrated deep into the flanks, and by November 23 the 2 prongs of the attack had linked up about 60 miles west of Stalingrad. The encirclement of the 2 German armies in Stalingrad was complete. The German High Command urged Hitler to allow Paulus and his forces to break out of the encirclement and rejoin the main German forces west of the city, but Hitler would not contemplate a retreat from the Volga River and ordered Paulus to stand and fight. With winter setting in and food and medical supplies dwindling, Paulus' forces grew weaker. In mid-December Hitler allowed one of the most talented German commanders, Field Marshal Erich von Manstein, to form a special army corps to rescue Paulus' forces by fighting its way eastward, but Hitler refused to let Paulus fight his way westward at the same time in order to link up with Manstein. This fatal decision doomed Paulus' forces, since the main German forces now simply lacked the reserves needed to break through the Soviet encirclement single-handedly. Hitler exhorted the trapped German forces to fight to the death, but on January 31, 1943, Paulus surrendered, 91,000 frozen, starving men. All that was left of the 6th and 4th Armies, and 24 generals surrendered with him. Besides being the greatest battle of the war, Stalingrad proved to be the turning point of the military struggle between Germany and the Soviet Union. The battle used up precious German reserves, destroyed 2 entire armies, and humiliated the prestigious German war machine. It also marked the increasing skill and professionalism of a group of younger Soviet generals who had emerged as capable commanders, chief among whom was Zhukov. Meanwhile, early in January 1943, only just in time, Hitler acknowledged that the encirclement of the Germans in Stalingrad would lead to an even worse disaster unless he extricated his forces from the Caucasus. Kleist was therefore ordered to retreat, while his northern flank of 600 miles was still protected by the desperate resistance of the encircled Paulus. Kleist's forces were making their way back across the Don at Rostov when Paulus at last surrendered. Had Paulus surrendered 3 weeks earlier, after 7 weeks of isolation, Kleist's escape would have been impossible. Even west of Rostov there were threats to Kleist's line of retreat. In January, 2 Soviet armies, the one under General Nikolai Fyodorovich Vatutin, the other under General Philip Ivanovich Golikov, had crossed the Don upstream from Serafimovich and were thrusting southwestward to the Donets between Kamensk and Kharkov. Vatutin's forces, having crossed the Donets at Izium, took Lozovaya Junction on February 11. Golikov's took Kharkov 5 days later. Farther to the north, a 3rd Soviet army, under General Ivan Danilovich Cherniakovsky, had initiated a drive westward from Voronezh on February 2 and had retaken Kursk on February 8. Thus, the Germans had to retreat from all the territory they had taken in their Great Summer Offensive in 1942. The Caucasus returned to Soviet hands. A sudden thaw supervened to hamper the Red Army's transport of supplies and reinforcements across the swollen courses of the great rivers. With the momentum of the Soviet counteroffensive thus slowed, the Germans made good their retreat to the Dnieper along the easier routes of the Black Sea littoral and were able, before the end of February 1943, to mount a counteroffensive of their own. The invasion of Northwest Africa, December 1942. When the U.S. and British strategists had decided on torch Allied landings on the western coast of North Africa, late in July 1942, it remained to settle the practical details of the operation. The purpose of torch was to hem Rommel's forces in between U.S. troops on the west and British troops to the east. After considerable discussion, it was finally agreed that landings, under the supreme command of Major General Dwight D. Eisenhower, should be made on November 8 at 3 places in the vicinity of Casablanca on the Atlantic coast of Morocco and on beaches near Oran and near Algiers itself on the Mediterranean coast of Algeria. The amphibious landings would involve a total of about 110,000 troops, most of them Americans. The conciliation of the French on whose colonial territory the landings would be made was a more delicate matter. All of French North Africa was still loyal to the Vichy government of Marshal Pétain, with which the United States, unlike Great Britain, was still formally maintaining diplomatic relations. Thus, the French commander-in-chief in Algeria, General Alphonse Juin, and his counterpart in Morocco, General Charles-Auguste Nogues, were subordinate to the supreme commander of all Vichy's forces, namely Admiral Jean-François Darlas. American diplomats and generals tried to gain these officers' collaboration with the Allies in the landings, for it was vital to try to avoid a situation in which Vichy French troops put up armed resistance to the landings at the beaches. The U.S.-British landings at Algiers began on November 8 and were met by little French resistance. The simultaneous landings near Oran met stiffer resistance, and on November 9 the whole U.S. plan of operations was dislocated by a French counterattack on the Arza beachhead. Around Casablanca the U.S. landings were accomplished without difficulty, but resistance developed when the invaders tried to expand their beachheads. On November 10, however, the fighting was called off, and next day the French authorities in Morocco concluded an armistice with the Americans. The landing in Algiers, meanwhile, was complicated by the fact that Darlas himself was in the city at the time. The situation was muddled, with some French troops loyal to Pétain while others backed de Gaulle and the anti-Vichy French general whom the Allies were sponsoring in North Africa, Henri Giroux. On November 11, 1942, in reaction to the Allied landings, German and Italian forces overran southern France, the metropolitan territory hitherto under Pétain's immediate authority. This event helped induce Nogues and the other French commanders in Algeria to assent to Darlas's proposals for a working agreement with the Allies, including recognition of Giroux as military commander-in-chief of the French forces. Concluded on November 13, the agreement was promptly endorsed by Eisenhower. French West Africa, including Senegal, with the port of Dakar, likewise followed Darlas's lead. The Germans, however, by mining the exit from the harbor of Toulon, forestalled plans for the escape of the main French fleet from metropolitan France to North Africa. On November 27, the French crews scuttled their ships to avoid capture. On December 24, 1942, Darlas was assassinated. Both royalist and Gaullist circles in North Africa had steadfastly objected to him on political grounds. Giroux thereupon took his place, for a time, as French High Commissioner in North Africa.